On June 23, 2023, Yevgeny Prigozhin, leader of the Russian private military company Wagner, which has recently been engaged in fierce battles for Bakhmut, claimed that Wagner's field camps were shelled by artillery units of the Russian regular army. Prigozhin accused the Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and the head of the General Staff Valery Gerasimov of deliberately attempting to physically destroy the entire Wagner group. He stated,
"The Council of Commanders of PMC Wagner has made a decision. The atrocities committed by the military leadership of the country must be stopped. They are disregarding the lives of soldiers and have forgotten the concept of justice. Those who caused harm to our comrades today and squandered the lives of tens of thousands of Russian soldiers will be held accountable. I urge no one to resist."
In less than a day, PMC Wagner took control of Rostov-on-Don, a major transport and logistics center in the south of Russia. The police and the National Guard quickly fled, leaving the city's 1.2 million inhabitants to fend for themselves. The headquarters of the Southern Military District, located in the city, was captured without any resistance. Minister of Defense First Deputy, General Yunusbek Yevkurov, and the Deputy Chief of Staff of the Main Intelligence Directorate, General Vladimir Alexeyev, were detained by Prighozhin. He demanded that Shoigu and Gerasimov voluntarily come to the headquarters. When his demand wasn't met, he stated, quote-unquote,
"I will proceed to Moscow. We are ready to die. All of us."
A heavily armored military column of Wagnerites moved toward the Russian capital with unprecedented speed. Along their route, they blocked and left behind another million-plus city, Voronezh, and then approached Moscow, almost unopposed. The government and elites fled the capital in panic. The only resistance they managed to organize was the use of sand-loaded trucks to block the highways. Allegedly, bridges across the Akar River were mined, and several military brigades were preparing to confront the Wagner forces on the outskirts of Moscow. But to be honest, it all seemed more like a gesture of desperation. The crown had fallen from Putin's head and was swiftly rolling to the feet of Yevgeny Prigozhin. Yet, when they were just 160 miles away from Moscow, Prighozhin announced that a personal agreement had been reached with Putin and the uprising must be halted. However, there would be no happy ending for Yevgeny Viktorovich's story. 2 months later, on August 24, Prighozhin boarded his private jet in Moscow, took off for St. Petersburg, and just 20 minutes after departure, his aircraft disintegrated in midair, crashing in the rural area near the city of Tver. Prighozhin, his chief military executive Dmitry Wagner-Utkin, and the chief executive officer of the rear services Valery Rover-Chekalov were killed instantly. With the top management gone, PMC Wagner was essentially decapitated. Today, I'm here to piece together a sequence of events and answer a series of questions. Who the hell is Yevgeny Prigozhin in the first place? What was his way from selling hot dogs in Leningrad to building his own private army? What factors led him to confront Russian deep state and challenge Putin on his own turf? Why did Prighozhin, holding considerable political influence, halt his actions just before reaching for the Russian throne? And what was the price of falling short in his endeavor? Born in 1961 and raised on the streets of Leningrad in the 1970s, Zhenya Prighozhin quickly became involved in criminal activities. By the time he reached 18, he had already received a 2.5-year probation sentence for theft. After being deported from Leningrad, he settled in Novgorod, where he was supposed to work at a chemical factory. Yet from an early age, Zhenya knew that he was meant for greater deeds. He illegally returned to Leningrad, where he partnered with a new acquaintance named Alexander Bushman to form a gang. Together, they performed an audacious robbery, breaking into the flat of Tovarish Osipov, residing at English Prospect in the very heart of Leningrad. Their snatch was enormous. A vase, a candy bowl, a napkin holder, and 20 units of various wine glasses. Though this may seem insignificant, the success of their crime lay not in the size of the loot, but in their ability to escape without any repercussions. Both Prighozhin and Bushman were utterly surprised by one simple fact: no one came after them. Between March 1st and March 20th, 1980, Prighozhin, along with Bushman and 3 other accomplices, committed at least 3 armed robberies and 1 instance of fraud. On March 20th, they assaulted a young woman. As she was walking home, Prighozhin confronted her, choking her until she lost consciousness. They took her coat, boots, and earrings. However, the ongoing crime was spotted by a police patrol. They managed to apprehend one of Prighozhin's accomplices, who, after being taken into custody, testified against the rest of the gang. Prighozhin was arrested and this time was sentenced to 13 years in prison. This story provides a rough, yet a fair understanding of Prighozhin's psychological profile. One may notice a certain dedication to what he perceives as his way. There are traits of audacious and opportunistic behavior that gets increasingly more violent when he encounters no resistance to his actions. Prighozhin was granted parole in 1990. He started from scratch by establishing the first street hot dog stand in Leningrad. Interestingly, as a sales point, he chose a flea market named Proxy, notoriously known for its criminal activity. There, towards the end of 1991, he met his former classmate, Boris Spector. At the time of the collapse of the USSR, Boris and his associate, Georgian and Israeli entrepreneur Mikhail Mirilashvili, were involved in developing of a net of casinos named Conti and the first private retail in St. Petersburg. They invited Prighozhin to join their retail network Contrast as a partner. Allegedly, he was also involved in the casino business as a so-called rishala, someone who resolved occasional issues with both the government and the mafia. It was during that time that Prighozhin met the key figure of his entire life. I need to make it clear, in 1991 in Russia, there was no substantial difference between officials and bandits. Everyone just claimed their share using available instruments. I was a child at the time, yet I remember that Conti casinos and slot machines were literally everywhere, even in the halls of metro stations. So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that Prighozhin and Putin hit it off right away. You know, streets of Leningrad had a unique way of uniting people. From this point on, Prighozhin's career skyrocketed. In a short span, he acquired several restaurants and transformed them into iconic places, true masterpieces that were booked weeks in advance. He took an old tourist ship and transformed it into Russia's first floating restaurant, New Island. It became a true gem of St. Petersburg gastronomic scene. Prighozhin clearly knew his business, which is why it's no surprise that he eventually became some kind of a personal cook for Putin, starting as Sobchak's assistant, then during his time as prime minister and later as a president, Putin often called Prighozhin to organize grand receptions. There he is, for example, right behind the shoulder of W. Over the next 10 years, Prighozhin secured numerous state contracts for food supply to municipal institutions, the military, schools, and kindergartens. He also succeeded in government-approved real estate development. In a word, he lived the wealthy life of a Kremlin-related entrepreneur. However, he was just one among many, just another entrepreneur in a long line of Putin's associates and allies. But as we already know, Prighozhin was not one to settle. He sought more and found a way to stand from the line. The Internet Research Agency, also known as Trolls Factory, was officially registered in 2013 and encompassed more than 15 different online publishing entities. However, reports from the Computational Propaganda Center at Oxford University suggest that the first organized social media campaign emerged during 2009 regional elections. Its methodology was simple, yet remarkably effective. Picture this. An article or a video surfaces accusing Putin of blatant thievery and corruption. In a matter of hours, hundreds if not thousands of comments appear, refuting the claims and painting Putin in a positive light. Within days of the original publication, various online publishers under Prighozhin's control would expose the author as a corrupt journalist, a puppet of the West, and an enemy of the Russian nation. The brilliance lay in the semi-automated nature of the entire process, with thousands of comments generated under articles, videos, and posts based on specific keywords. This is what really made Prighozhin one of the closest Putin's trusties, and one of the most influential businessmen in Russia. Yet his ultimate ascent was still to come. In 2014. In February 2014, after months of intense protests, the pro-Russian president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, relinquished his position and sought refuge in Russia, leaving his country in a political and social turmoil. Seizing the opportunity presented by the turbulence in Ukraine, Putin swiftly moved to annex Crimea and instigate a series of proxy conflicts in the eastern region of the country. With the guidance of Russian main intelligence directorates and the Federal Security Service, armed uprisings were incited in Ukraine's Donetsk and Luhansk region. What initially began as an endeavor fueled by local separatists and fringe paramilitary groups from Russia soon escalated into a full-scale armed confrontation between the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and the armed force of Ukraine. Predictably, Russia denied all allegations of involvement in the conflict, cynically asserting that Ukraine was engaged in a struggle against local farmers, miners, and tractor drivers who had somehow managed to acquire tanks and armored vehicles from a nearby ammunition. This strategy had some serious flaws, however. You can lie. You can lie to a bunch of people over a substantial period of time. But when you repeat your lies many times, when you keep saying that you have nothing to do with the people's riots against illegitimate coup d'etat, those who would never succeed without your direct interventions start to believe your own lies. They commence to believe that they are the only ones who must be credited. You illuminate those bandits, those brogues, those losers with legitimacy. The individuals nurtured by your political and military support start to challenge your authority, because now they possess a significant political autonomy. And this is a one-way road. Consequently, when faced with proxies that were no longer under control, a logical solution emerged: the creation of a new proxy force. This entity would have no legal connections to the Kremlin, but would be fully directed by a trusted individual. And who could be more reliable in this role than a man who had been literally catering to Putin and his influential circle? The earliest references to PMC Wagner, also known as Wagner Group or self-proclaimed musicians, can be traced back to 2015. According to reports from fontanka.ru, Dmitry Wagner-Utkin, a former colonel of the main intelligence directorate and later a high-ranking member of the Hong Kong-based PMC Slavic Corps, established his own military unit to operate in the so-called Luhansk People's Republic. During its initial stages, PMC Wagner was not the massive army, with its own air force, missile systems or tank battalions, staffed with thousands of recruits. Instead, it functioned as a lightly armored, highly mobile group of professional mercenaries. The activities undertaken by Wagner Group remained shrouded in mystery, and their very existence was a subject of debate, let alone determining the true beneficiary behind the company. These mercenaries were largely perceived as one of Russia's proxy forces, potentially created either by the main intelligence directorate or the Federal Security Service to undertake delicate operations. And make no mistake, PMC Wagner was initially created for one and only one purpose. By the end of 2014, the so-called heroes of Donbass had come to realization of the immense power they held. Armed and backed by significant public support, they swiftly established connections within regional business circles. These individuals, sometimes being semi-literal, comprehended their own legitimacy and recognized their considerable political potential. As a result, they began to behave like political actors, attempting to break free from the strings tied to them by Kremlin puppet masters. This course of events was absolutely unacceptable. Allow me to present you a sequence of events, and I let you judge whether those occurrences were a sheer coincidence or the result of the thorough planning. Please meet Alexei Mozgovoi, a former sergeant of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, a prominent military activist, and a key figure in the Luhansk People's Militia. He got an overconfident demeanor during the spring of 2015. Mozgovoi organized a quite successful international forum, titled Anti-Fascism, Internationalism and Solidarity on May 7, followed by a military parade on May 9 in Alchevsk, despite a direct prohibition from Moscow. Witnesses reveal that Igor Plotnitsky, the head of the Luhansk People's Republic, explicitly warned Mozgovoi that disobedience would result in execution. What a Nostradamus! Mozgovoi indeed was killed on May 27. His vehicle was ambushed on the highway and turned into Swiss cheese with several machine guns. Our next guest is Pavel Dryomov, also known as Batya. Dryomov was a Russian nationalist and self-proclaimed Cossack. He advocated for the takeover and nationalization of major industrial assets in Luhansk and Donetsk, which he believed were held by Jewish owners. When you mix semi-literal Cossack bravado with financial ambitions, trouble often follows. On December 12, 2015, en route to his own wedding in Kadiivka, Dryomov's car was blown up, resulting in his imminent death. Nikolai Tsepkalov, a Ukrainian engineer of Russian origin, aligned himself with separatists during the conflict and swiftly climbed the military ranks. He became the chief of staff of the Southern United Army and later the Prime Minister of the Luhansk People's Republic. Forced into retirement by the end of 2015, Tsepkalov's ambitions persisted. He was arrested for attempted coup d'etat in September 2016 and shortly after was found dead in his cell, with broken ribs, bruises, and ligature marks on the neck. The official cause of death? Suicide. Through auto asphyxiation. Arsen Pavlov, aka Motorola, born in Ukhtar, Russian military private and small-time thug, sentenced for Grand Theft Auto. Allegedly, as a former militant, he was proposed to go to Donbass in exchange for amnesty. Together with his friend Mikhail Givitolstych, they rose to prominence, showcasing how mediocrity could lead to a remarkable career and widespread popularity in an environment where violence and brute force were the only arguments. The increasingly popular Motorola met his demise in the elevator of his own residence on October 16, 2016. By the way, his friend Givi also met a violent end when his office in Makeyevka was attacked with a jet flamethrower Bumblebee. This incident occurred just a few months later, in February 2017. There were also many other forced retirements in the region, such as the bombing of the head of the Donetsk People's Republic, Alexander Zakharchenko, for instance. Back in 2017, it was challenging to ascertain whether these acts were the result of Ukrainian SBU or Russian FSB involvement, as both entities had reasons to eliminate those guys. However, as time passed, it became increasingly evident that these actions bear the signature of PMC Wagner. Yet their true surge in popularity unfolded during 2017-2018, in the context of the Syrian war. Mercenaries under Wagner's command were strategically deployed to secure economically valuable regions. Simultaneously, their military activities expanded into Africa, specifically the Central African Republic, Mali, and Libya. In this period, various journalists began to speculate about Prighozhin's potential ownership of Wagner. However, Prighozhin vehemently denied any associations with the PMC and took legal actions against journalists who asserted his involvement. Well, actually his denial held a certain truth, because he wasn't the direct beneficiary. Someone else was. To make a short recap, let's have a look at Prighozhin's empire on the brink of the war in Ukraine. His food company Concord held a monopoly in the school meals market and was a key supplier to the Russian army and National Guard. It was no exaggeration, a multi-billion business. His internet research agency operated over 500,000 bots across the post-USSR region and countless fake accounts in the western segment of the internet. His military company was actively engaged in various countries, including Libya, Central African Republic, Mozambique, Sudan, Guinea, Guinea-Bissau, Madagascar, Zimbabwe, Angola, and of course, Syria. Remarkably, Prighozhin achieved substantial success in Mali. Not only did he manage to defeat ISIL groups within the country, but also effectively squeezed the French Foreign Legion from Mali's soil. Something that may not have been well received, neither by the France nor by their allies. By early 2022, Prighozhin had consolidated significant power and possessed a diverse array of valuable assets. Apart from Putin's inner circle, he was no doubt the most influential businessman in Russia. But keep in mind that Prighozhin was just another proxy, a pair of spare hands for the man who was eager to stay away from everything, for the man who wanted to have a large space for maneuvering, and we are not their politics. It had all changed on February 23, 2022.
Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Following the full-scale retreat of Russian forces from Kiev in March 2022 and subsequent failures in the Kharkov and Kherson regions later that year, the true state of the Russian army could no longer be concealed. It was exposed as weak, lacking professionalism, poorly motivated, and armed with outdated Soviet-era machinery rolled off the assembly lines in 1960s, 1970s. It was exposed as the army for parades on Red Square, but not for the war on hostile terrains. And as it was often the case for Russia, their super-duper high-tech military operation turned into a meat grinder, fueled first and foremost by manpower. As the human resources of the self-proclaimed Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics were depleting, and the need for general mobilization emerged on the agenda, Prighozhin appeared at Putin's door with another audacious, risky, yet highly effective plan. True to his style, Prighozhin's idea was daring and flagrantly illegal. The proposition was that Wagner would be permitted to recruit prisoners convicted for grave crimes in exchange for presidential pardon after 6 months of service. Given the extremely challenging conditions of service on the most dangerous fronts, along with the absence of proper training, it was estimated that up to 95% of these recruits were destined to perish. Moreover, these convicted recruits faced the specter of capital punishment for attempting to leave the unit's location, for refusing to participate in assault actions, and even for being captured as prisoners of war. A chilling example of these practices within the Wagner Group came to light through the case of Alexei Nuzhin, a criminal convict turned Wagnerite, who later became a prisoner of war. Nuzhin was exchanged for Ukrainian soldiers and then publicly executed. That was a real-life suicide squad. You serve and manage to survive, you are free to go. Otherwise, you know. You may assume that such units are of no use against a professional army. However, our homegrown Amanda Waller managed to address several significant problems at once. First, Wagner delayed the need for general mobilization, which would have occurred earlier and on larger scale otherwise. And second, by employing Wagner to launch attacks on Ukrainian strongholds using waves of poorly armed manpower, Prighozhin was able to uncover Ukrainian firing positions and suppress them with artillery. Yes, you got it right. They used their recruits as decoys, akin to live-bait fishing. The Wagner unit could have been relegated to mere wastage of human lives if it wasn't for Prighozhin's media empire that turned every single symbolic success, every single captured strongpoint, every hill, every village into some sort of faithful victory. Again of Popasna, train station and small town in Donetsk Oblast, was portrayed as significant as the capture of Berlin in 1945. Of course, speaking about his success, Prighozhin was presenting it as if his units were there alone, completely forgetting that they were widely supported by the army all the time. At some point, it became an across-the-board belief that Wagner was the sole combat-ready unit in all of Russia. Obviously, it was a blatant exaggeration and a rhetorical trick used by Prighozhin to enhance his own political influence. Prighozhin was authorized to expand his vast supply of free manpower at an unprecedented rate. and he was willing to pay the price in blood. His triumphs in places like Popasna, Solidar, and Bakhmut were achieved at the expense of countless faceless prisoners recruited from various correctional facilities across Russia. According to Prigozhin's own claims, during the battle for Bakhmut alone, which unfolded between August 2022 and May 2023, Wagner suffered a staggering loss of 20,000 men killed. With a 1-to-3 ratio of killed to wounded, which is a charitable reading in artillery-centered war, it means appalling 80,000 casualties in a battle for a regional city with population of around 70,000 that held no strategic significance whatsoever. These losses mirror grim rates experienced in Red Army during Stalin era. So when someone speculates about outstanding fighting capabilities of Wagner, I puke a little bit. Believe it or not, I'm not the only one who noticed the glaring discrepancy between Prigozhin's hype and his actual contributions. It was also noticed by the Ministry of Defense. While the Minister of Defense Shoigu and the head of the General Staff Gerasimov were subjects to ridicule and disdain from the entire country, including the so-called patriots, Prigozhin was enjoying a surge of glory. In the spring of 2023, the Minister of Defense lobbied the law, allowing the recruitment of prisoners for contract service, effectively ending the recruitment campaign of Wagner in Russian prisons. Furthermore, the supply of artillery shells for Wagnerites was curtailed to match the average levels in army. And surprise, surprise, with the reduction of artillery support and the cessation of recruitment from prisons, Wagner promptly lost its momentum. This is where the seeds of the future riot were sown. Prigozhin did try various avenues to regain his preferential status, from direct appeals to Putin to full-blown scandals targeting Shoigu and Gerasimov. He was making videos with fallen Wagnerites in the background, continuously humiliated military leadership, and posted daily demands, claims, and accusations. I'm uncertain about his initial plan. Perhaps he aimed to give military commanders a hard time, making them believe that supplying Wagner is cheaper than constantly fighting back Prigozhin. Or maybe he was just creating a certain narrative that would excuse the impending failures that were inevitable in the absence of comfortable abundance. What I do know for sure is that the only outcome for Prigozhin was becoming a local meme arising from one of his tantrum-filled videos.
Шойгу! Герасимов! Где боеприпасы?
The situation took even more negative turn when Minister Shoigu issued an order for all volunteer battalions and private military companies to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense. While on surface, this might seem as a fair move, aimed at centralizing command and enhancing control over troops, make no mistake. It was a directive specifically targeting Wagner. It was a move against the parallel army that was growing beyond any control. In response, Prighozhin declared,
PMC Wagner won't sign anything and will not become a unit of the Ministry of Defense. We're too occupied fighting enemies on the outskirts of Bakhmut.
However, it was clear that Prighozhin had found himself in a situation similar to that of Donbass heroes. He had accumulated too much power in his hands and had gained an unprecedented level of political recognition, even among military elites. At this point, it's important to explain one thing. Political and military leadership in Russia is completely disconnected from public opinion. Therefore, someone's popularity does not translate into proportional political gravitas within the state apparatus. And it was exactly the case of Prighozhin. Indeed, he was very popular among pro-military audience, among patriots, in army at large, but he had absolutely no power to influence Putin's decisions regarding appointments. He had no leverage to dismiss St. Petersburg Mayor Alexander Beglov, whom he wholeheartedly hated, let alone Shoigu and Gerasimov. They were Putin's appointed officials, while he was just Putin's businessman. By June 2023, the situation for Yevgeny Viktorovich and PMC Wagner seemed grim. It appeared that he had lost the direct access to Vladimir Putin. His relations with the military leadership were awful, both financially and in terms of military supplies. He was entirely dependent on the Russian state. Moreover, without a continuous influx of prisoners, he had to feed the never-stopping meat grinder with his professional mercenary corps. Several months of shell famine, multiplied by several risky assault operations in artillery-situated regions, and the entire Wagner group would be annihilated, taking Prigozhin's ambitions down with it. But Yevgeny Viktorovich wasn't looking for the fate of another Donbass hero, nor was he going to lose his most valuable asset. Well, this entire narrative with shelling of Wagner field camps, sanctioned by the army command, doesn't look reliable for me. On the video we can see several broken trees, some debris and 2 small fire spots in the trenches. Frankly speaking, I can see a camp here, let alone a camp demolished by artillery. So this entire "we were stabbed in the back" story looks rather as provocation, an artificial casus belli to openly oppose Shoigu and Gerasimov. And it's important to underline, at least at the beginning, Putin was out of the equation. It was all about dismissing Minister of Defense Shoigu and Head of General Staff Gerasimov, those untalented, useless parquet generals, this train wreck of military leadership. Dismiss and substitute them by somebody more loyal to Prighozhin and PMC Wagner. I guess Prighozhin himself didn't expect how swift it would be. In less than a day, he unopposed entered the million-plus city, the major hub of the entire operation, Rostov-on-Don. Police ran away. National Guard was nowhere to be found. Military staff of the headquarters of the Southern Military District gave up with no resistance. Prighozhin captured 2 highly ranked generals and learned that they were just 2 scared middle-aged men. Not more, not less. No one was out on the streets to oppose PMC Wagner. Locals were taking pictures with them and bringing food and drinks. Who was out there to support Mr. Russians love me, my rating is 146%? Not a single soul. In his urgent address to the nation, Putin called Prighozhin a traitor and promised that the riot would be brutally suppressed. However, at the same time, people from his inner circle were fleeing Moscow in panic. Presidential aircraft would leave the capital just several hours later. Unsuccessful attempts to stop Wagner using the Air Force led to 2 helicopters being shot down by the air defense system Igla, traveling within the column. After that, Telegram channels associated with Prighozhin announced that Pynya, a derogatory form of Putin's surname, had made a wrong choice, and soon Russia would have a new president. It suddenly became clear that there were no troops, no real forces capable of stopping PMC Wagner. It became obvious that all those officers from the security service, National Guard and police, who were extremely effective in arresting unarmed students, would flee from Moscow as fast as their colleagues did from Rostov-on-Don. The Wagner military column was just 150 miles from Moscow, ready to enter the city. The crown of the Russian Empire, covered in dust and blood, lay at Prighozhin's feet. And this is where he commanded: stop. A common thread could be observed throughout Prighozhin's entire career. He was an adventurer. He was a soldier of fortune to some extent, but above all, he was the businessman. There was always a significant financial interest driving his actions, so when he unexpectedly gained an enormous political influence, the influence that could elevate him to the Russian throne, he seemed unsure of how to wield it. I highly doubt that he had any plans to leverage this influence beyond securing his safe exit from Ukrainian terrains. It's unclear what kind of guarantees were given to him by Putin, but what the hell, how naive one should be to trust any of these assurances? With a knife literally put against his throat, Putin would have said and would have done anything just to get the situation back under control. The dilemma was that while whining on this betrayal, Putin openly acknowledged that PMC Wagner had received state support over the years.
Между тем хочу отметить, и хочу, чтобы тоже мы все знали об этом, содержание всей группы «Вагнер» полностью обеспечилось государством.
As such, Wagner was no longer a viable proxy force, even in African operations. Substituting it with regular units of the Russian army would have been a safer option. At this point, Russia had little to lose in terms of sanctions or international isolation anyway. On July 26, soldiers from Niger National Guard arrested President Ramaphosa and established a military junta. They demanded an immediate departure of the French Foreign Legion, which was stationed in the country. However, France, heavily relied on uranium mined in Niger, declined. Furthermore, ECOWAS countries threatened the junta with a full-scale military invasion. This presented perhaps the final opportunity for PMC Wagner to demonstrate its utility. Having achieved success in pushing France out of Mali, Prighozhin likely hoped for a similar victory in Niger, dubbing the coup d'etat as a part of the struggle against colonialists. Apparently, he spent his last weeks trying to establish connections with the military junta. He made appearances at Russia-Africa Forum in St. Petersburg and even personally journeyed to Africa, sharing videos from fields. However, his efforts seemed to be in vain. France didn't yield, and neither did ECOWAS. The result for PMC Wagner was clear: yet another formidable adversary, the Fifth Republic. Let me provide a brief recap of the situation by the evening of August 23. In the list of Prighozhin's enemies, we might safely put Vladimir Putin. Prighozhin betrayed him, he threatened him, he made him look pitiful and scared. Minister of Defense General Sergei Shoigu. Well, no comments. Prighozhin had been dressing him down publicly over a couple of months and openly demanded for his scalp. The same is true for the head of the staff, General Gerasimov, who was accused by Prighozhin of being responsible for all the fails on the front line. Ukraine regards Prighozhin as a war criminal, and no doubt considers him as a legitimate military target. France and its allies. The Fifth Republic barely likes what's going on in Africa and could consider PMC Wagner as a vital threat for its interest on the continent. And what about Prighozhin's friends? Well, I have no idea. But what I know for sure is that this picture doesn't look good for Yevgeny Viktorovich.
Работаем. Температура плюс 50. Все как мы любим. ЧВК «Вагнер» проводит РПД. Делает Россию еще более великой. На всех...
This is the final video featuring Prighozhin. Shortly after its filming, he embarked on a return trip to Russia, presumably for a scheduled meeting with Putin. His flight from Moscow Sheremetyevo to St. Petersburg Pulkovo was originally booked for August 22 at 9 p.m., with only 3 passengers listed: Prighozhin, Utkin, and Chikalov. However, the flight was subsequently postponed to 11:20 p.m. and finally rescheduled for August 23 at 5:30 p.m. Notably, this time Prighozhin took all of his 4 bodyguards with him. I guess meeting with Putin was not very fruitful. The fact that Putin and Prighozhin had indeed met was indirectly confirmed by Putin's spokesperson, Peskov. When asked whether they had met just prior to Prighozhin's death, Peskov responded, Putin and Prighozhin didn't meet in the Kremlin. If you have some expertise in reading Russian official statements, this should be interpreted as they have met somewhere else. A private Embraer Legacy 600 took off from Moscow Sheremetyevo Airport at 5:59 p.m. local time and commenced its climb to cruise altitude while maintaining communication with the Sheremetyevo tower. The pilots didn't report anything suspicious until the moment when the Embraer Legacy 600 suddenly disappeared from the radar. The crash occurred at approximately 6:20 p.m. in the village of Kuzhenkino in Tver Oblast. A fall of Prighozhin from the sky was filmed by one of the eyewitnesses. And hell, it's worth watching.
Это беспилотник. Сбили, бабахнуло в 2 раза, взорвалось, падает. Ты посмотри, падает. упал. Вон тут куски летят. Смотри, какой клуб. Поднимается.
So, what can we learn from this footage? The aircraft is shown spiraling downward, with the right wing and stabilizer absent. There are no known mechanical failures that could lead to the detachment of an entire wing and tail section. Thus, I'm not even considering technical malfunction as a plausible explanation. The lady who was filming mentioned that she heard two distinct sounds. This scenario could be feasible if there were two explosives placed on the aircraft. The initial explosion could have caused the wing to detach, while the second one led to the detachment of the tail section. However, if we look closer, we may notice a diffusion trace in the sky at an altitude much lower than the airplane cruise altitude. Let's take into account that Putin's main residence, Valdai Dolgi Bordy, equipped with multiple air defense systems, is located nearby. Prighozhin's airplane was indeed within the affected range of the S-300 air defense system. The notion of two distinct bangs might also be explained by the phenomenon that occurs when a missile surpasses the sound barrier, producing a noise that resembles an explosion. Thus, the witness might have confused the sound barrier noise and the subsequent explosion for two separate bangs. If the aircraft was struck near the right wing, it could result in mechanical damage severe enough to cause the wing to be turned from the fuselage. Subsequently, the detached wing could have collided with the stabilizer. The missile theory gained some support from another witness, who claimed to have heard three bangs. If this person was in closer proximity to S-300 launcher, he might have heard the missile launch, the exceeding of sound barrier noise, and finally the explosion, resulting in a total of 3 consecutive bangs. Videos showing the burning fuselage are not of high enough quality to make a definitive conclusion. Nevertheless, noticeable perforations, resembling those caused by metal shrapnel, are clearly present, consistent with the appearances of striking elements from the S-300 warhead. In summary, while I won't dismiss the potential for sabotage, several indirect pieces of evidence suggest that Prighozhin's plane might have been targeted by a missile from an S-300 air defense system located in proximity to Vladimir Putin's residence. In fact, the dismantlement of PMC Wagner appeared to be a comprehensive and ongoing process throughout the month of August. Notably, their temporary camp in Belarus was disassembled, and many of the mercenaries were granted leave. Similarly, their military cemetery in southern Russia underwent changes that were quite telling.
Этот обелиск открывал Евгений Викторович Пригожин в Николаевке. А вот здесь, вот, где вот эта дорожка, там были могилы, это все снесено. Вы что творите-то, ребят? Да это же...
The intentions seemed to be wiping away PMC Wagner as an entity, even erasing its memory. Prighozhin was certainly aware of what's going on, possibly realizing the imminent danger he was in. His expectations might have been to meet with Putin personally, counting on the security guarantees he believed he had received. However, we already know the result of this meeting. It very much settles in the paradigm of medieval showdowns, where suzerain demands his vassal to arrive for a small talk and then kills him. Predictably, the official Kremlin denies any involvement in Prighozhin's demise, but regardless of the eventual official explanation, the entire narrative is a severe blow to the Kremlin. If the aircraft was downed by an air defense system and Putin was aware of this, it constitutes a terrorist attack on Russian soil, organized or authorized by a Russian president. The attack not only claimed the lives of key Wagner personnel, but also those of 7 other individuals, 3 of whom had no affiliation with Wagner or military services whatsoever. Furthermore, it posed a grave threat to countless individuals on the ground. This situation surpasses all bounds, even by the standards of contemporary Russia. If it was shot down by a missile and Putin didn't know about it, then he's not in control. He's not aware of what's going on. And this is the worst scenario for personalist dictatorship, like Putin's regime. If it indeed turns out to be a sabotage operation, It means that Ukrainian, or French, or NATO special services feel themselves at home in one of the most secure airports of Russia. If they managed to liquidate Prighozhin in his own aircraft, just miles from Putin's primary residence, then I don't know. They are almighty, and it's really time to capitulate, because who knows what else they can do. So I'm sure that in the end the investigation team will announce something absolutely ridiculous, like, one of Prighozhin's bodyguards occasionally detonated the hand grenade, and that's why this catastrophe occurred. Or something similarly insane, but politically acceptable.
Wait for a second. Philosopher. Are you really sure that I'm actually dead? Would you bet your life that I actually was there? Do you remember when I showed up in St. Petersburg after the riot to take my cash from the office? That wasn't me. This guy looks like me, but he has all 5 fingers. And I lost one in jail. Or a search in my villa, when they were showing what a luxurious life I'm living. Did you notice anything suspicious? Like wigs and dresses, for example? Is it me with a fake beard? Or my doppelganger? And this one? This is a valid passport with my photo and someone else's name. And this one with my name and a photo of someone else. Did you know that there was another airplane of mine right behind the shutdown Embraer? It stayed in the air for a while and then got back to Sheremetyevo. The next day, it left for Azerbaijan. I am a master of disguise. I switch planes, I change itineraries all the time. Keep in mind, death is my business, and my business is doing great. So what's your bet, philosopher?
I wouldn't bet a single dime that Prighozhin is actually dead and will not surface somewhere in the Africa and the Middle East after a plastic surgery with a new identity. Neither would I bet that he is alive. The worst time for the truth is the time when anything could be the truth. If you like this video, I invite you to check out my other documentaries, for instance about the largest technogenic train catastrophe in history, or about tremendous defeat of Russian army in Chechnya. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit notification bell to stay updated about new videos. I'm the Northern Philosopher, have a good one.